Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Stephen Whitfield. I'm the Director of the Global Food and Environment Institute here at the University of Leeds. And it's my pleasure to host this session and to welcome you to this virtual seminar. It's part of our GFEI monthly webinar series. And today we're really pleased to be joined by Dan Crossley, who is the Executive Director at the Food Ethics Council. The Food Ethics Council is a not-for-profit organisation which advocates for ethical food policy. And Dan himself has worked in food sustainability for over 20 years on a very wide range of issues. Today is going to be sharing what I think will be some very timely reflections on the UK government's food strategy for England, which is 1 year on from its introduction. Dan's also contributed in lots of ways to research and teaching on food at the university, and he is a member of our external advisory board for GFEI, so it's a real pleasure to welcome him, albeit virtually, back to Leeds. We're really grateful to you, Dan, for doing this for us. As I mentioned, this webinar is part of a series of webinars. Do have a look at the Q&A function where there's a link to the other webinars in our series. And you can also follow GFEI on LinkedIn for updates on all of our activities and outputs. The presentation itself is going to take about 20 minutes. Please do make use of the Q&A function to ask any questions that you have for our speaker. At the end of the presentation, I'll collate those questions and we'll have about 10 minutes or so for a Q&A session. And just a reminder, the webinar is being recorded. The recording is going to be made available to everyone via YouTube, and you'll get a link to that shortly after the webinar. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Dan. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here today. As Stephen said, I have some links with GFEI on the advisory board, and GFEI doing some brilliant, really important work, bringing together lots of different disciplines across food systems. Again, as Stephen said, I'm Dan. I'm Exec Director at Food Ethics Council, and I'm here to share a perspective. And I wanted to emphasise that, a perspective on the good food cycle 1 year on. I'll come on in a minute to do a very quick recap of what the good food cycle is and what it set out to do. But the kind of caveat up front is this is one perspective from me as a, if you like, a commentator almost, someone that I'm not involved in some of those crunchy conversations that are happening in Whitehall. I don't have sort of privileged insider information on this. This is just my own perspectives on where I see the good food cycle almost 1 year on. But on the positive side, I hope I bring, as Stephen said, about 20 years of working on food systems, including on policy, trying to influence, mostly indirectly influence policy. And we're in conversations with lots of networks of different people, some of who are very close to this. So I bring perspectives, hopefully insights, and crucially, I guess, questions and challenge, which I encourage you all to take away. So this won't be a kind of data heavy set of slides. This is my perspectives. I wanted to start with, I guess, a very, very personal reflection briefly, with this image of a bike with a rusty chain. And I want to talk about briefly my mum, who passed away 2 years ago, or will be 2 years ago next week. You may ask why I start a presentation talking about my mum. There's two reasons. One is that she passed away on the 15th of July, 2 years ago. So when the Good Food Cycle was launched, which was on the 15th of July, which is also a family birthday, that was the first anniversary of my mum's passing. So that date is significant and etched in my mind, as you might appreciate. But secondly, and the reason for this picture on here, which is a stock image, but it's because I failed to take a picture myself, but is that a few weeks ago I was with my dad, and I sort of took mum's old bike that she hadn't ridden, obviously, for a long time. And it did have a rusty chain. And I guess in a nutshell, I wrote about this in an article in the Grocer recently, but my overarching summary, if you like, telling you what my overarching perspective on the Good Food Cycle is, that and to link perhaps slightly clumsily to the analogy around a bicycle itself, is that the chain was rusty, the tires were flat, and if it had just been left in the corner of the garage, it would have ended up as scrap. But with a bit of TLC, a replacement chain, some air in the tires, it's running smoothly again. My son rode it the other day, and the reason I talk about that is in the context of Good Food Cycle is it's the same. I think the Good Food Cycle has got a strong frame. The direction is right, but it will, as the headline says on here, it will seize up without attention, investment, and political will. So I guess that's my starting point on this, is that I think that the Good Food Cycle, this food strategy for England that got brought in on the 15th last year, is potentially powerful and useful, but that it needs a new lease of life. So, jumping back a little bit, what is the Good Food Cycle? I suspect most people on this call will be very familiar with it, so I'm not going to do a big long speech about what got announced, said almost a year ago. But just for those that are less familiar, this is something launched by the then Food Security and Rural Affairs Minister Daniel Zeichner back in Bradford, say on the 15th of July. It is the National Food Strategy for England, crucially, so England only. And I start this talk by almost apologising, if you like, that the fact that most of this is very England-centric. We work UK-wide, are interested in what and working indeed in what's happening across the four nations. But by the nature of the devolved administrations and the different responsibilities they have, it meant that much, if not all, of the Good Food Cycle is more directly relevant for England. So it was, Wales, and just on that, again, people on this call will know this, but we know Wales has recently committed to, or is exploring the idea of a national food strategy for Wales. Scotland already has its Good Food Nation Act. Northern Ireland has its Northern Ireland Food Strategic Framework and Action Plan, which we did a workshop on over in Belfast fairly recently. And this was something that was building on, crucially, one of the strengths of it wasn't starting from scratch. So it was building on work that Henry Dimbleby led, and we were involved in some of the public dialogue work for Henry Dimbleby's work probably a few years ago now. But it was building on some of those foundations and some of the previous work rather than starting from scratch. So again, one of the strengths of this being that it recognised that there's been a huge amount of work to diagnose some of the problems around food, farming, environment, health, etc. But that it was trying to bring those together in a more coordinated way. And it set out, it talked about priority outcomes for the wider food system. And the way they talked about it in a policy paper at the time, they talked about a good food cycle where businesses have the confidence to invest in healthier, sustainable, more resilient production and supply that makes great British food more affordable and accessible to everyone. And that investment in turn will deliver improved health, environment, and resilience outcomes, strengthen food security and the wider economy, etc., etc. So this idea of that it's not a sort of single intervention. It's they're trying to argue the case that there's a multiple effects that can come off the back of this. And the 10, I'm not going to read them out, the 10 priority outcomes identified at the time were, I guess, bucketed it into 4 groups, and DEFRA the kind of lead department on this, held some series of workshops with in conjunction with IGD. The 10 project outcomes were around healthier, more affordable food, good growth, sustainable and resilient supply, and vibrant food cultures. So those were the kind of areas that were identified, and they came up with those 10 priority outcomes. And at the time, I commented, as did others, that there was always one or two things missing from it. From when any government announcement, there will always be those of us in the NGO world that say yes, and can we also have X, Y, Z? But as a general, as a sweeping statement, as a broad set, there was some really strong outcomes in there. It was covering a wide range of different parts of the food and farming system. And yeah, a lot to like in principle. I guess what it didn't do, and it didn't, to be fair, it wasn't designed to do, it didn't have lots of concrete actions at the time. It was much more of an initial framework, priority outcomes, with the promise that there would be a kind of drip feed of policies coming out over the year and indeed years ahead. More on that later. So, how's it going so far? You will all have your own answers to that question. And I guess the reason I put this quote up on there was, I guess, to kind of situate this, the promise at the time. This is a recipe aimed at driving a generational change in the nation's relationship with food. And at lots of levels, it's deeply unfair, less than a year in, to be too critical of this good food cycle. They never claimed or expected to transform everything in the first year. So I think that's my first point, is that this is a long ball game we're playing here. Having said that, as I said, there has been a drip feed of some useful things, which I'll come on to in a moment. But I feel there's been various things that have distracted and sidetracked along the way. No disrespect to the civil servants and others that are working on this. Some of them may be on this call, but it's I guess there's been I feel slightly underwhelmed, if I'm honest, a year in terms of where we're at, and there's a number of reasons for that. So 5 questions I just want to explore or raise today. I'm not claiming I will fully answer these, but these are just questions I think I wanted to put on the table. And these are: where, by whom, what, why, and how. So it's some very simple questions at one level, but there's a lot within each of them. And I'll come on to these in turn in a moment. But just so where is the good food cycle showing up, or where's it not? By whom? So who is being involved in shaping, influencing the good food cycle, the food systems work? What has actually been done, and perhaps what not so far? Why is this important? Thinking about the diagnosis of some of the problems in the good food cycle. And then finally, how does it bring policies together? So how is it trying to bring some of that coherence to the policy world that many of us are calling for? And Food Ethics Council, I won't repeat the description Stephen gave before, but one of the ways that someone described us recently is that we're here to hold what's difficult so that coherence becomes possible. So hold what's difficult so that coherence becomes possible. So that's not us having all the answers, absolutely not, but we're there to bring together different people and networks from different parts of the broader food system in the UK to connect with each other, learn, share, inspire, challenge each other to come up with more in the round solutions. So 5 questions. Start with where. So where is it showing up? If there was time, I'd love to hear where you're seeing the good food cycle show up and where you're not. But just at a very, very simplistic, and you can tell my level of academic research involved in this, which is slightly flippantly, but actually, like at the level in terms of where's it showing up on the political agenda, then if you look just at Hansard, which is the kind of the Bible that keeps track of, or the parliamentary Bible rather, that keeps track of the different discussions that are happening both in the Commons and the Lords, then the number of mentions of the good food cycle specifically is very limited. So there are just in the last year, 3 mentions of the good food cycle in the House of Commons and 3 in the House of Lords. And you may or may not be able to read the detail there, but you can go and have a look if you're interested. But that includes someone asking a parliamentary question in March of the then Minister, Dame Angela Eagle, about what's the role of alternative proteins in the good food cycle strategy. So there are some specific mentions of it in some parliamentary discussions, but in practice, it hasn't been talked about and used hardly at all. Only 6 mentions in Hansard, and 18 mentions I made it in government press releases over the last sort of 11 and a bit months, including that includes 6 when it was launched. And again, the academics, researchers in the building, in the room will pick holes in this as a scientific, thorough piece of analysis. This is very simplistic, looking at when good food cycle specifically was mentioned. So don't take this as gospel. There may have been talk of food strategies, etc., but I was just interested in this in that particular phrase, the good food cycle, because that was the way that it was being talked about, and it hasn't been visible on the political agenda. I know that behind the scenes that's some departments, particularly EFRA, are still or have been using it, and some will know again better than me on the depth of that. But it's something that we haven't seen show up much. Is the short version. By whom? So who has, there's interesting questions about for whom as well, which I won't go into, but by whom? So who has been influencing, shaping the agenda? I mean, in short, lots of different actors, lots of different players have been trying to influence, as always, what the UK government does. But I guess in terms of more specifically, there are, I guess, 2 particular bodies I wanted to just flag. Again, some will be familiar with them, but the Food Strategy Advisory Board was set up as this independent expert group March 2025, and it has a range of people on it. Some would say, including us, and I think some of the other NGOs, that there was much less NGO representation on there than we would like. This wasn't me calling to be on it. I don't think I should be on it. But with 1 or 2 notable exceptions, like Anna Taylor from Food Foundation, there were very few NGO voices on there, and it was more of an industry-dominated advisory board, which they have an important role to play, but we would argue they shouldn't be the only voices around the table. To counter that to some degree, I was really pleased, and we were really pleased that the Citizen Advisory Council was brought in, which was, I guess, jointly curated by the Food Foundation and Food Farming Countryside Commission, and they hosted so the ambassadors from the Food Foundation and those citizens that had been involved in the Food Farming Countryside Commission's food conversation, which was a sort of public dialogue process. Some of those were brought together to then specifically draw on their own lived experience and expertise to feed into what the UK government could do around this good food cycle. So I think and again, there's still questions, I guess, open questions about the extent to which that has influenced or will influence. I think it's too early to say. And obviously, there have been changes of minister, again, very recently. So there's lots of this is about getting new ministers up to speed again. But just at a principle level, something that we support for the Ethics Council is the active involvement of citizens, trusting them. And again, I've been lucky enough to be involved in some public dialogue processes over the last few years, where you see the power and the magic of ordinary people, in inverted commas, which is a horrible phrase, but of citizens from a range of different backgrounds coming together with some experts to provide that input, but having the space to explore this stuff. And actually, we should look and trust what citizens are coming up with there, rather than thinking of them as sometimes people think of them as, we should only listen to the official experts on this, the academic or NGO or industry experts. And I'm a firm believer that whilst those experts have got a role, I think we should listen to citizens, and I think politicians are increasingly recognising that. So what has actually been done at Introduce? This is an incomplete list, deliberately, but I guess just to give a flavour of 1 or 2 of the things that have come in over the last nearly 12 months, that link to the good food cycle, at least into the food strategy. So very recently, we had the 2050 farming roadmap. Again, England centred, at the same time as the government put out a response to Baroness Batter's independent farm profitability review. We had the land use framework for England. We had the 10-year health plan a little while ago. There's consulting, or will be consulting, on proposals for mandatory reporting and healthy food sales, etc., etc. The point is, there are a number of things that have been done, introduced, and in often linked to the good food cycle and the food strategy, which is very positive, I would say. I think that those of you that will be close to this and close to the policy advocacy bill will know is that many of those, and certainly the first three of those on there, are much more in the kind of framework space. Well, certainly the first two, the farming roadmap, land use framework in particular, much more in the kind of framework space rather than diving into specific policies necessarily. But nonetheless, there has been some new initiatives, some new frameworks, some new plans put out there over the last 12 months, which I said is to be welcomed largely, and people will have different views on the detail of them. But there hasn't as yet been. It's been a sort of slightly strange sequence of events, having the way that these things drip feed out with changes of ministers. So there has been, to the point of what's not yet being done, we haven't yet seen in practice bold, concrete policies on the whole range of different issues that relate to food, so food, farming, health, environment, welfare, etc. And I put in here again to be hopefully to be fair to those that are actively involved in trying to make this happen. That question: legitimate reasons or excuses? I think there are lots of genuinely legitimate pressures that civil servants and policymakers, government and others have been under, that we can't deny. The cost of living, pressures on budgets, geopolitics, the various conflicts and wars that some that rumbled on from before last July 15th, some that have emerged since. Crucially, political, and again, at a kind of more UK government level, political instability and change, and reshuffles. Again, this is very, very important, obvious point, but we've had, 10 secretaries of state for DEFRA in the last 10 years. We've had regular changes of food and farming minister or food minister for food security and rural affairs in recent times. And that makes the whole process of trying to bring in a food strategy and attach things to it very, very difficult. It takes a few months for a new minister to get up to speed, and it's therefore very, very tough to try and get to get them up to speed in and implementing stuff and consulting and implementing before they're potentially moved on. And again, we've had civil servants. They've had a lot to handle. Over the last few years, post with Brexit, COVID, all the rest of it, but also in very recent times, the work around EU alignment, which is kind of, dominated much of civil servant activity. So that's the kind of relationship between UK and EU, which could have lots of positive benefits, but equally, it takes up a lot of time, meaning that there is less time to implement some of the concrete actions that many on this call might want to see. And the last thing I put there, this list could go on, but is the sort of relative strength of DEFRA. And again, this is not me just on the sidelines slagging off DEFRA. It's just the reality of where DEFRA is in terms of, it's not known as a heavyweight department. And yeah, its influence has been much less than certainly we at Food Ethics Council would want to see. This is not just about DEFRA, crucially. This is a multi-department, needs to be multi-department effort, but the relative strength of DEFRA, I would say they're under-resourced for the important work they're doing. Why? So why a long-term food strategy matters? Again, I'll skip through this relatively quickly because I think most people on this call will have a sense of that. But we would argue that short-termism incoherence doesn't work, and that we need to pull together in the same direction and need that shared purpose, belonging, and agency, which is what we sometimes talk about. We talk about we're all food citizens, and we all, we need that sense of direction. We don't all need to be doing exactly the same thing, but having that long-term certainty and learning from the likes of Denmark, Brazil, and one or two others in this space, I think is important. The other part of why, slightly differently, but is I touched on this, but is the diagnosis that came out of the good food cycle and that built on Henry Dibbleby's work and this system change lens, which I'm very supportive of. This notion of breaking the junk food cycle, addressing that problem about invisibility of nature, and crucially bringing in the resilience gap. So inspired by the really important work of Professor Tim Lang. So I think the why bit, the diagnosis, I think in the strategy, food strategy, is pretty good, pretty strong. It's the delivery that people are looking for more from. I put an extra why at the top because we're very keen on getting to the root causes of some of this. So keep asking why. And then the last question for this part is, how does it bring policies together? So part of the purpose of any strategy, I would imagine, is about trying to provide some framework and coherence and join things up. So if we think about policy coherence and the recent farming roadmap, for example, again, don't worry about the detail on the slide, but the point was that the good food cycle is mentioned, you see it there, as one of those key things, setting out priority incomes for the wider food system and feeding and linking up with the farming roadmap, which is more specifically looking at the transition for the farming sector for England over the next 25 years. So they are trying to join up and link these things up, which is really important. There's a lot more to do in practice to make this happen. And an unashamed plug that we're doing a session, a webinar in September, all about roots and roots, when policies collide. So we're looking at this example of this notion of when policies, not specific to the good food cycle, but thinking about policies relating to food and farming, when the government might say something with one hand, one department, and something else with the other department, sort of give with one, take with the other, and then crucially thinking about how we can go beyond that, how we can bring more coherence. So at Food Ethics Council, there's lots we could say. I'll keep it short for reasons of time, but there are. We did some work a couple of years ago and kind of co-produced with others, co-created some principles for fair policy making. So we would want to see these brought in throughout any work around good food cycle, learning from those affected, going upstream, addressing the root causes, making the private interest serve the public good, leaving no one behind, and taking a whole of government approach. These are not, you would hope, not revolutionary, and I'm not going to expand on them now for reasons of time, but they are hopefully fairly self-evident. But the question is, how does the good food cycle match up with these? And I won't attempt to answer those now. I'll leave you to go away and ponder. But to what extent does the good food cycle work? Bring in, learn from those affected. To what extent is it addressing root causes? What about private interest in this? Is it leaving no one behind? And is it taking a whole of government approach? I think it's doing some of it. Is the short version. Final reflections from me. I think there is a window of opportunity. Again, I feel like I'm using lots of cliches today, but there is a window of opportunity in the next few months. Obviously, likely incoming change of Prime Minister and the agenda and energy that's more devolved, the enthusiasm for more devolution and for different energy, perhaps, that Andy Burnham, if he gets in, will bring. I'm hearing different views from people on the extent to which he buys into food systems being important, but obviously important decisions about who gets made Chancellor and the like could have a big impact here. I do think, I would say this, working in the food system space, I do think there is space for something big and transformational. I don't know exactly what that is, and people will have views. I'd love to hear them. But I think there is an opportunity in the very short term, the next 2 or 3 months, to push for something much, much bigger. I guess questions to take away, how can those of us pushing positive change be more joined up? It's very easy for someone on the sidelines to say, government needs to be more joined up. They need to bring in bold policies. They need, that's very easy to say. And then the practice of doing it can be tricky, especially when civil society and those pushing for change themselves are often not coherent, joined up. So I think there's a lot more we can do. And we're certainly part of lots of different alliances and networks to start to do that. what can we do to support the government? So again, there's a level of challenge we need to bring here, but actually it's that how can we help mentality that I know government departments and civil servants prefer and like. What are the opportunities in and with developed nations? As I touched on before. And finally, back to my kind of opening gambit, if you like, I do think it's this needs more than a back to the bike analogy. We do need to oil the chain and change gear with the good food cycle. I think it is as I said, has a strong frame. I think it's trying to do the right thing. There's lots of the ingredients there, that some of the farming roadmap stuff and the 10-year health plan, etc., more towards prevention. I think some of those are are broadly positive things. There are things we will challenge, but we do need to step up a gear. Like we can't wait for things to go back to normal, inverted commas. That will not happen. We need to crack on and bring in some bolder interventions very soon. With that, I will close with my email and LinkedIn. Please do follow up. That's again a shameless picture of me doing a bike challenge recently. I thought I'd bring it back to the bike, but love to hear your views. Obviously, hear your questions in a moment, and then but do follow up if there's things in here that you would like to explore together. We're very keen to do what we can as a small organisation ourselves, but do what we can to encourage that more fair, inclusive, resilient, sustainable, healthy, humane food system. So we'd love to join up with you on that journey. And I will, with that, close out and come back to Stephen.
Great, thanks so much for that, Dan. A really useful overview of the good food cycle, and lots of kind of points to get us thinking about. Please do post your questions in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to keep track of those and fire them back at Dan. I'm going to start though with a question for you, Dan. You sort of highlighted that sort of the value of the good food cycle is in putting those multifaceted priorities for the food system together in one place, and sort of encouraging us to think in a systems way about the sort of the multifaceted and sort of interacting goals that we might have for the food system. And that obviously also leads us to think about the trade-offs between those different priorities and where some of those kind of challenging contradictions might be. So I think across those 10 priorities, it touches on access to safe food for all, expanding export markets. It talks about building kind of preparedness to supply chain shocks into the food system. I'm just interested on your take on where do you think within those priorities are the most challenging contradictions? What are the kind of stickiest points, and do you see those sticky points kind of becoming kind of more visible and in the sort of political agenda? Yeah, just if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I mean, a lot in and I think there certainly are trade-offs and tensions between the, whether we're looking specifically at the original 10 priority outcomes or more generally in what the UK government's trying to do. I think, I mean, to take one example, I think is a live example, and one that some people will be wrestling with. There's clearly a strong government agenda around pushing growth, which part of me understands and the need for economic growth, but the other part of me is wearing my more radical hat, saying I would prefer us to push for greater well-being and things rather than fixate on economic growth alone. But so I guess the example recently is around poultry. So the kind of government has announced in the past year or so that it's majoring in on kind of horticulture, which I'm fully supportive of, but also poultry, so having a kind of poultry growth plan, poultry growth strategy too, which again plays to that point about tensions, because it's being badged as a cheap, affordable protein with all the and it's kind of recognising there's been this inexorable rise in demand for poultry, particularly chicken in the UK, over the past decade or two. And at one level, that's kind of, you can't deny that. That's but at another level, when you get into what the implications are for from a nutritional perspective, but also from a animal welfare perspective, environmental perspective. Again, people on this call will be familiar with the River Wye, the kind of implications of potentially some intensive industrial chicken, the pollution that can be linked to that, the animal welfare concerns that are very much live. So I guess that's an obvious point, but about poultry being one of those kind of touch points that's I think will be increasingly debated certainly by civil society and others, challenging some of those, that push for growth and push an assumption that affordable protein in the form of poultry needs to be, if that is the desired direction, can we challenge that? How can we challenge that? So I guess that's just one example, but there are lots of different ones where it's sometimes trading off environment versus welfare, sometimes trading off affordability, and wanting good food to be genuinely available, accessible to all, with a desire for higher standards. And we haven't talked about, this has been, I guess by its nature, has been quite a UK and particularly England-centric thing, but there are obviously lots of international dimensions to this too in terms of trade, which again I know in your role, Stephen, you'll be familiar with. So yeah, there's certainly lots of sticky issues. This isn't a simple. There's not simple solutions to this.
Yeah, thanks. There's a few questions in the chat around, I think, the implementation of these principles into policy and practice. There's a question from Effie specifically about devolution and the community empowerment bill in the UK and how that's providing more powers to mayors and local authorities. How do you see that in terms of the impact that it might have on food system priorities and actions? Do you see that as something positive? FBS specifically, what the implications might be for things like public food procurement, food access, right to grow, and generally more democratic food systems?
Yeah, thank you, Effie, for the question. A very good question, as I'd expect from Effie. I mean, I'm definitely not, wouldn't claim to be an expert in the bill itself, but the principle I'm supportive of. Again, personally, I guess we would expect Andy Burnham to come in to be pushing this agenda harder. I mean, I think it comes with challenges in terms of it needs if we link this to more localized food systems and I guess crucially the infrastructure that's needed to support that, then I think it's great if things are being more devolved to more regional, local areas. It's in principle a fantastic thing because of very much as Effie said, that it brings people closer to their food. It opens up opportunities for those more localized food systems, and it can support things like right to grow and other such initiatives, which I think are hugely important. But it needs that investment in. It can't just be devolved without having the money behind it to make it happen. Again, which is a fairly obvious thing to say, but I think with food specifically, we've lost so much of that local infrastructure, whether it's the local abattoirs or food hubs, whatever it might be. I did some work on this legislation like 20 years ago about a local to London and local to London kind of food brand, the idea of that. And one of the conclusions of that 20 years ago was that there's a need to invest in much more regional infrastructure. But I think from a citizenship point of view and democratic point of view, I'm certainly supportive of bringing it closer to people, taking it away from being kind of Westminster centric.
And I think there's a related question from Sarah. So Effie mentioned public food procurement, and Sarah's asking if that's where we're at with public food procurement. Is there political will to do something there, to use that as a lever to bring about more sustainable systems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, Sarah. I mean, I don't claim to. I can't speak on behalf of the government, so I don't know in terms of where the government's at. All I can say is that I guess there's two sides to it. One is that certainly in the citizen conversations, Citizen Advisory Council, that this came up as one of the key levers that should be pushed. It's not a new, as Sarah will know, not a new, a new argument for it. There are people who long argued for using public procurement as a key lever, but again, someone I won't name them, but someone senior up in the food and farming world speaking last week was saying, relative public procurement really important and can set the direction, but actually relative to private sector spending in this space, it's still a tiny proportion. So again, that's not to say it's not important. I think it absolutely is. And we can learn from the likes of Denmark and some of the more obvious examples of others that have used that lever and set some bold targets and then supported proper public procurement. But yeah, others are more expert on that than me.
Great. There's a question from David Barling. So he's asking, do you think that the farming and ag production side has a policy priority at the moment? Are we seeing the recommendations of the Batters review kind of being taken seriously and implemented, for example?
Yeah, good question, David. Again, it's hard to say at the moment because there is just so much uncertainty and change. But it does feel from a sort of commentator point of view, it feels like the UK government it's got some making up to do to farmers. It recognises that there's a lot of bad blood certainly between some farmers and government for around inheritance tax and beyond. So there's definitely, it feels like there's some kind of making up that needs to happen. So there's perhaps been a bit more emphasis on those relationships, and it was good to see. I was at Groundswell last week, Regenerative Agriculture Festival. Emma Reynolds there spoke. Stephen Morgan, the new food minister, was there. Food, Rural Affairs and Farming, I guess, minister were there. So it's good that they are, as well as the climate minister and Kemi Badenoch and others. So it's good that I think in general food and farming is starting to get the agenda a bit more. And I think there is. I think to David's question, there is a bit more emphasis on perhaps on the farming ag side as a key area, but again, different people will have different interpretations of that, and I think it can all change very quickly depending on who's in the Treasury and who's minister. So I think that will change, and people still say health, and surprisingly, health is still a big should be a big policy priority. But certainly, Minette Batter's work has been really important and has put more of an emphasis on individual farmer profitability and resilience, which again, if framed in the right way, can be a very important part of this.
Yeah. And there's a question from Matthew Cashier. Apologies if I pronounced that wrongly. He's asking about the consumer expectations side of this. So saying if consumers have been conditioned to expect food that's cheap, convenient, and always available, how do we shift that expectation? Whose responsibility is it? Where does that sit within this broader picture?
Yeah, again, another good question. I mean, briefly, there's lots of answers to that, but I mean, my take would be firstly that we try and avoid talking about people as consumers, as I touched on before. That because if we so we've all got responsibility in how we frame the narratives around this. So if we talk about people as people or as food citizens, actually that takes us away from the notion that people are helpless consumers at the end of a long chain, and the only way they can influence stuff is if they've got a big enough pocket to buy the organic fair trade, whatever your proxy is, good food. So some of it is the responsibility we all have, and those are working in civil society and trying to influence policy and in industry for changing the language we use. But ultimately, it's a collective thing. But I think government, to the point perhaps Matthew was kind of hinting at there, what's the role for UK government here? I think it does have a massive role to play in moving us away from a cheap food culture that's been ingrained the last 30 years, and we need to shift that. We'd argue we need things like a right to food, we need a long-term food bill, we need all those other things, but we need to think about the money inside of the equation and how people can engage, rather than get fixated on on a kind of some would say food strategy that's dominated by, or could be dominated by, one or two retailers, and could be all about ever cheaper food, which then leads to exploiting people and the environment.
Yeah. Maybe just following up on that, then I was interested in the Citizen Advisory Council that you were talking about, and I wonder, to what extent do you see that process being joined up and meaningfully influencing the sort of policy frameworks and the implementation that we might be hoping to see from the good food cycle?
Good question. I think it's at one level it's too early to say how much influence it's had, and so we haven't been, full disclosure, we haven't been directly involved in the process. It's been led by Food Farming Countryside Commission and Food Foundation. But I do think we're starting to see it impacting more. And from what I've heard, certainly previous minister was very receptive to what citizens were pushing for and asking for. So I think there is, I would hope that gets, and it's not just citizens we need to listen to. We need to bring in farmers more and others. So I guess we're very keen that it's not a big industry, like to caricature simplistically now, but like a dominated agenda. I think I am hopeful and optimistic that there is this gradual shift towards bringing citizens more and them having influence. I think it's too early at the moment to be able to point to like concrete things that's led to, but the fact that government ministers are engaging more, listening to pressure will come from people ultimately, and if they're hearing, if they are genuinely listening to what people are telling them, and so do have a look at the Citizens Advisory Council works. It is very compelling, and we'll be hearing from one of those hopefully. I know they're speaking at various events over the coming months, so I'd encourage people to meet and hear what they have to say themselves.
Great. We're getting close to time, so I'll maybe just finish with a question from Matt Barkley, which is a fairly open and broad question, so use it to sort of make any sort of final reflections or points that you'd like to make, Dan. But he asks, what lessons can be drawn from the progress in food systems work over the past couple of years, which might point to ways in which we can improve on the government's objectives for the food system going forward?
Big one to finish on. Maybe two reflections off the back of that. I don't think it'll fully answer your question, Matt, but I guess one is around, I think that we need a more radical agenda. So I think there's been a nervousness to kind of be big and bold and set long-term plans and ambitions. We need that positive vision that was one of the criticisms of the farming roadmap, that there perhaps wasn't that succinct, punchy, clear, like exciting vision within that. It was a sort of 70-odd page document rather than something compelling. The second bit, I guess, is around accountability and having, again, I looked at something like the Good Food Nation Act. It's not up in Scotland, not perfect, but has, one of the strengths of that is it's got accountability mechanisms in there. And I think, we need to, I would argue that it would benefit the UK level from having something like that, that will hold where different local authorities and regions are held to account for what they're doing and not doing. So I guess that's thing about ambition and accountability. And there's for lots of people think there's been a kind of delivery or implementation gap, which, as I said before, is somewhat unfair at one level, but at another level we do need to get on with stuff. So we need some stronger vision and some targets that people can really get their head around, whether it's healthy sales targets or beyond. But we need something that will give a bit more direction. And we're never going to get certainty and then say, well, but we need that ambition that we can all get behind.
Great. I think that's a good point to close on. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat that I didn't quite manage to get to, so we'll share those questions with Dan, and hopefully you can get in touch with people, respond by email if there's something there that you want to respond to. Thanks again, Dan, for the presentation. Thanks everyone for joining. Just a reminder, do check out the GFEI LinkedIn page and website. There's links to all of our previous webinars on there, and we'll also share the recording for this one once it's uploaded. All right, have a good rest of the day. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.